Well, folks, we made it. Election season is over. Well, at least for the next 4 to 6 months. Then the talking heads will be back and the ads will slowly creep in, and all our national news will talk about is November 2016. It's a vicious cycle, and one that seems to get worse every year. People tear each other apart, right and left and right, based on a few hot-button issues, or even worse, based on some silly gaffe that they made while on camera. Even Jon Stewart of The Daily Show a few weeks ago was joking that debates are now less about the issues. It's pretty black and white. We know what people are going to say before they get there. And more, just try not to say something stupid for 90 minutes. And then, when something inevitably happens, as it always does, come on, if a camera was following you for months on end, wouldn't something inevitably go wrong? But once that happens, there's no grace. Now, I'll admit, while I avoid sharing my political opinions in church, I'm very, very guilty of lambasting politicians while I'm at home. Just ask David, God bless him. I guess that's my confession for the day. While I stand here and constantly preach grace, I rarely give it to certain politicians. I start yelling at the computer before I even hear what someone said. There have been times when I've even wanted to use my Reverend title in letters to our representatives with the delusional hope that it would help my words carry more weight. Pro tip, it doesn't. On Election Day this year, a fellow United Methodist clergywoman posted some of John Wesley's words to guide our actions that day and in following days. And he said, I met those of our society who had votes in the ensuing election, and I advised them to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy, to speak no evil of the person they voted against, and to take care of that their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side. Those are some wise words, some hard words, and they hit me like a ton of bricks. Because we're all still people. We're all still in our communities, and while we disagree on the means by which we should improve those communities, we all care. Just as John Wesley said at another time, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. And where charity and love prevail, there is God. In the midst of all this, I was reminded of a little story by Dr. Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. And so I present to you today, for our third reading, the parable of the Zacks.
One day, making tracks in the prairie of Prax, came a north-going Zax, a north-going Zax, and a south-going Zax. A north-going Zax and a south-going Zax. And it happened that both of them came to a place where they bumped. There they stood, foot to foot, face to face. Look here now, the north-going Zax said. Hey, say, you are blocking my path. You are right in my way. I'm a north-going Zax, and I always go north. Get out of my way now and let me go forth. Who's in whose way? Snapped the south-going Zax. I always go south, making south-going tracks. So you're in my way, and I ask you to move and let me go south in my south-going groove. Then the north-going Zax said with north-going pride, I never have taken a step to one side, and I'll prove to you that I won't change my ways if I have to keep standing here 59 days. And I'll prove to you, yelled the south-going Zacks, that I can stand here in the prairie of Prax for 59 years. For I live by a rule that I learned as a boy back in south-going school. Never budge, that's my rule. Never budge in the least, not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. I'll stay here not budging, I can and I will, if it makes you and me and the whole world stand still. Well, of course, the world didn't stand still. The world grew. In a couple of years, the new highway came through, and they built it right over those two stubborn Zacks and left them there, standing unbudged in their tracks.
We've all encountered a Zacks or two in our lives. And I'm willing to bet if you were to really push yourself, you could think of a Zacks you've met in church. And if you were to really push yourself, I bet you could think of a time when you've been a Zacks. It must be that way because it's always been that way, and if it's not that way, then everything's over. In Bible study this past Tuesday, we spent some time talking about those Zacks thoughts, those litmus tests that exist in every church, just as they do in our politics. The quick little ways to sum people up and determine where they stand in the grand scheme of things. I've never taken a sip of alcohol, says one churchgoer. I only buy fair trade coffee, says another. And while both of these actions stem out of good, faithful intentions to not hurt yourself or others, do no harm, as Wesley encouraged. These same statements often give us the understanding of what Zacks school we came from. Is it north-going school or south-going school? Maybe I should say, is it right-going school or left-going school? The problem comes, though, when we are convinced that it is our way, that's the only way, that the world will end if we give in even a little, that if, God forbid, the church doesn't back us 100%, then it can't be our church, and we won't accomplish any good whatsoever because it will be tainted. Never budge, that's my rule, never budge in the least. Not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. I'll stay here, not budging. I can and I will if it makes you and me and the whole world stand still. Boy, can we think that God is small-minded? Like God has ever said, well, you think that, so you're done. Instead, we get lavish, extravagant welcome. We get parties upon our return. We get no questions asked, hugs and robes, and I know you've been through a lot. I'm so glad you're home. I don't care what you've done. All that matters is that you're here. And we know that, and we are glad for that welcome, that grace, when it's extended to us. But when it's aimed at someone else who's claiming welcome and love and knowledge of God, when we vehemently disagree with them, we often end up like the older brother. Hold up, what? I'm here, I'm doing everything perfectly, and yet you jet it off. We're not the same. Pride is a dangerous, dangerous thing. I wonder how many times the prodigal son thought about going home before he hit rock bottom. But his Zach's pride stopped him. To go home, he'd have to admit something. In the words of the Fonz, he'd have to admit that he was not as correct as he originally thought he was. But eventually, the son admits it, and he goes home. He swallows his pride. He swallows his pride so much that he's willing to be a servant to his own family. That's a whole lot of swallowing. And then we encounter grace. The father doesn't punish his son. He doesn't pull out his own pride and say, "I told you so." But oh, he could have. He could have told his son what he already knew, that what he did was wrong. He could have dragged his son further through the muck, asking where every last dime was that he had spent. With who? What did you eat? We don't do that stuff. I'll need to be reimbursed, you know. You wanted to be on your own, you got it. Instead, he throws a party. Both sides swallow their pride for something bigger to happen. There's more pride in the story, you know. Just like in every household, there's a sibling there that's more than happy to offer their 2 cents. The older brother's pride was prompting him to say, "I told you so. You failed. You were so wrong. I didn't screw up." Breaking the grip of pride means not worrying about who was right and who was wrong. Wriggling away from pride's grasp on us means overpowering the compulsion to keep score. Because we know that our God isn't a God who keeps score. God isn't concerned with how we got lost. God's just glad we got home. Sometimes we want to do something new in the church, proclaim or live out the gospel in a whole new way. But our pride or our Zach school, our fear gets in the way. Will we allow our pride to stand in the way of something actually happening in our world? Or are we willing to take the risk that comes with reaching out? We might have to admit that we were wrong if it doesn't work. Somebody else might say, "I told you so." But someone else might say, "I was wrong too." In our Zach story, we see how this standoff ends. It's not a happy ending. The Zachses think they'll get the whole world to stand still, that things will stop until one of them gives out. They think that they have all the control. But instead, the world didn't stand still. The world grew. In a couple of years, the new highway came through and they built it right over those 2 stubborn Zachs and left them there standing, unbudged in their tracks. My friends, we can keep fighting over the little things, but the world is going, to keep changing. And if we in the church aren't willing to see what's happening in the world and proclaim God's work, the good news in that world, then the world will pass us by, go right around us, while we remain completely unaware. Yikes. Now, we can still cling to our principles, and we should. But not every principle is a moral absolute. Principles don't make the world go round. I'm not saying that we should do things that seem immoral to us, not at all, but I'm pretty sure that everything isn't a life or death situation. I'm pretty sure that in most things, there is grace. Now, often we hear that passage from Galatians, there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And we think it means that we're all the same. But really, I think what Paul is getting at there is that our differences aren't too much for us to bridge over. We might come from different Zach schools, but that doesn't mean that we can't go a smidgen left or a scooch right to make sure that both of us can keep going. Because the world will keep going on without us, whether or not we choose to move with it. There's never a better time than now to risk going home, to take a chance and go back to the basics. To start with knowing that God is love, that we are loved, that all are loved, especially if the other option is to stand in the desert for 59 years with another Zach's. May God help us all.